October 1976, Chouteau County, Montana. The air in the third-floor courtroom of the Chouteau County Courthouse in Fort Benton was thick with the smell of old paper and dust. It was the smell of settled things, of deeds filed and disputes judged, of history recorded in thick, leather-bound ledgers. But nothing about the case of Finch versus Finch felt settled. Elspeth Finch sat alone at the plaintiff's table. She was 58 years old, a widow of 4 months. Her hands, chapped from lye soap and labor, were folded over a worn leather purse in her lap. She wore a simple navy blue dress, the one reserved for church and funerals. Her posture was straight. Her gaze was fixed on the grain of the oak bench in front of her. She did not look at the 2 men sitting at the opposite table, her late husband's brothers, Caleb and Josiah Finch. They were big men, wheat-fed and weathered by the high plains wind. They wore identical pearl-snap shirts and clean denim jeans. Their faces were set in grim, righteous lines. They were the defendants. They were the family. They believed the land was theirs by right, by blood, by the natural order of things. The farm was 2,160 acres of the finest dry land wheat country in the county. It sat astride the Teton River, a prime parcel with senior water rights dating back to a territorial claim from 1888. It had a 4-bedroom clapboard house, a red hip-roof barn, 3 steel grain bins with a combined capacity of 40,000 bushels, and a machine shed full of green and yellow John Deere equipment. Franklin Finch had worked that land for 40 years. Elspeth had worked it alongside him for 37. When Franklin died of a heart attack in June, slumped over the wheel of his pickup truck while checking a fence line, the farm passed to Elspeth. His will was simple, a single page drafted in 1955. Everything to his beloved wife. Caleb and Josiah contested it. They filed suit in August. Their claim was not a direct challenge to the will's validity. It was something older, something based on words spoken over a rotted fence post, on promises made in the heat of harvest, on the shared understanding of men. They claimed Franklin had promised them the farm, promised that the Finch land would stay with the Finch name. They argued for a constructive trust, a legal remedy for a promise broken. Their lawyer spoke of tradition, of legacy, of the unbroken chain of fathers and sons. The county listened. The county understood. The men at the Teton bar, the farmers at the grain elevator, the mechanics at the dealership, they all had a version of the story. Franklin was a good man, but sentimental. He must have told his brothers they'd be taken care of. A woman alone couldn't run 2,000 acres. Not this country. This country was unforgiving. It required a man's strength, a man's will. Elspeth was seen as an obstacle, a vessel of grief, clinging to something she could not possibly manage. They pitied her. They waited for her to yield to sense, to sell to the brothers for a fair price and move to town. She did not yield. She hired a young lawyer from Great Falls, a man named Peterson, who wore a suit that looked too new. He argued the law, the simple, unambiguous text of Franklin Finch's last will and testament. He argued that spoken promises, if they ever existed, were not legally binding. The trial lasted 2 days. It was a quiet affair. Witnesses described conversations they'd half heard years ago. The brothers testified about their decades of sweat, their unpaid labor, their belief that the farm was their inheritance as much as Franklin's. They painted a picture of a family bound by unspoken pacts. Elspeth did not testify. She sat, she listened, she watched. Now, on the 3rd day, it was time for the judge to rule. Judge Wallace Thorne was a man who had seen the Dust Bowl as a boy. He understood land and the passions it stirred. He looked over his spectacles at the silent woman, then at the 2 expectant brothers. The courtroom was full. Not a seat to be had. The people of Chouteau County had come to see the final act, to see the land returned to its rightful name. Judge Thorne cleared his throat. He acknowledged the brothers' long years of work on the farm. He spoke of the importance of family and tradition in a place like Chateau County. A murmur of agreement went through the gallery. Caleb and Josiah exchanged a look of grim satisfaction. Then the judge turned his attention to Elspeth's lawyer. He noted that the defense had presented a compelling emotional case, but one thin on legal precedent. The written will, he stated, was the paramount document. A sigh of disappointment rippled through the room. But the judge was not finished. He paused, looking down at his desk.
He said that Mrs. Finch's counsel, in a highly unusual move, had submitted a second document into evidence during chambers that morning. A document intended to demonstrate his client's long-term planning, her soundness of mind, and her profound, intricate understanding of the farm she stood to inherit. It was meant to rebut the implicit claim that she was a grieving, irrational woman incapable of stewardship. The judge picked up a sheaf of papers. It was, he announced, the last will and testament of Elspeth Finch, her own will. The room was silent. Caleb and Josiah stared, their faces masks of confusion. A will was for the dead. Elspeth was very much alive. What did her will have to do with anything? It was a trick, a legal absurdity. The brothers' lawyer stood up to object. He called it irrelevant, prejudicial, a desperate theatrical stunt. Judge Thorne overruled him. He said he had found the document highly relevant. He said it spoke directly to the question of stewardship. He said it was perhaps the most detailed and specific estate plan he had ever encountered. And he believed, in the interest of understanding the full context of the dispute, that it should be read into the record. Out loud. So, Judge Wallace Thorne, in the third-floor courtroom in Fort Benton, on a cold October morning in 1976, began to read. He read the preamble, the standard legal language. But then it began. The lists. The endless, meticulous, baffling lists. He read about the land, not as a single entity, but as a portfolio of assets, each with a specific, non-negotiable instruction. He read that the 800 acres north of the Teton River were to be immediately placed into a conservation easement with the state of Montana, permanently barring any future plowing, development, or irrigation. That land, the richest bottomland on the property, was to be returned to native prairie grasses, to buffalo grass, to blue grama, to needle and thread. A gasp went through the courtroom.
That was the best land. The land that produced 60 bushels of wheat an acre in a wet year. To turn it back to grass? It was madness. It was like burning money. He read about the water rights. The senior rights from 1888 were not to be used for irrigating wheat. Instead, the will stipulated the construction of a series of small check dams and catchment ponds designed to water livestock and create a wetland habitat for migratory birds. The will allocated $7,000 from the estate for the earthworks. He read about the livestock. The will dictated the sale of the entire herd of 60 Hereford cattle. In their place, the estate was to purchase a flock of 200 Rambouillet ewes. The will specified the exact bloodlines to be sought, from a breeder in Red Lodge, Montana. It outlined a rotational grazing plan based on the new native grass pastures. Sheep on a cattle and wheat ranch. It was an insult to the memory of every rancher in the county.
He read about the equipment. The new Gleaner L combine, Franklin's pride and joy, was to be sold at auction. The John Deere 4430 tractor as well. The plows, the discs, the seed drills, all of it, to be sold. The proceeds were not to be saved. They were to be used to purchase a single, brand-new Caterpillar D6 bulldozer. A bulldozer, not a tool for farming, a tool for tearing things down. He read about the buildings. The main farmhouse was to be kept, but the will ordered the demolition of the iconic red barn. It was a landmark, visible for miles.
The will stated it was inefficient, a fire hazard, and a relic of a bygone mode of agriculture. It was to be salvaged for its timbers, which were to be used to build smaller, more practical sheep sheds. The judge's voice droned on, a monotone, delivering one incomprehensible instruction after another. The sale of the northern parcels to the Hutterite colony nearby. The investment of the proceeds in government bonds, not in new land.
The establishment of a trust, not for a person, but for the maintenance of the fence lines, with a yearly budget of $300 for staples and wire. Each clause was a repudiation of conventional wisdom. Each instruction flew in the face of a century of agricultural practice in Chouteau County. It was not a plan to run a farm, it was a plan to dismantle it, to systematically undo everything Franklin Finch and his father before him had built. The people in the gallery shifted in their seats. They whispered to one another. They looked at Elspeth Finch, sitting serene and still, as if listening to a piece of familiar music. They saw her not just as a grieving widow, but as something far more unsettling. A woman who had harbored these strange, destructive ideas for years. Caleb and Josiah Finch were no longer confused. Their faces were flushed with anger. This was not a will. It was a manifesto of spite. It was a final, posthumous insult to their brother's memory. A plan to erase the Finch legacy from the land itself. They saw it now. She had planned this all along. She had poisoned Franklin's mind, and now she was revealing her true colors. The judge read the final clause. It stipulated that upon Elspeth Finch's death, the remaining land, the house, the sheep, and the trust were not to be given to any person. They were to be donated in their entirety to the Montana State University College of Agriculture, to be maintained in perpetuity as the Finch Experimental Dryland Farm. The farm would not go to family. It would not be sold. It would become a laboratory, an experiment. Judge Thorne set the papers down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the silence of shock, the silence of a community witnessing something it could not comprehend. The judge looked at the brothers. He looked at Elspeth. He then rendered his judgment. He found in favor of the defendant, Elspeth Finch. The original will of Franklin Finch was valid and binding. The farm was hers. He made no further comment on the document he had just read, but his meaning was clear. The will of Elspeth Finch, while not legally operative until her death, demonstrated a mind that was anything but addled by grief. It showed a terrifying clarity. A plan, however strange, that was deliberate and comprehensive. She was not a passive widow. She was a woman with a vision. The gavel fell. The story of that day in court became a piece of local folklore. The story of Elspeth Finch's will. The men of the county had one word for it: grief. They decided it was the only possible explanation. A profound, shattering grief that had unhinged her mind. She wasn't trying to run the farm. She was trying to destroy it as a monument to her loss. It was a woman's logic, emotional, irrational, tragic. At the Teton Bar, the consensus was swift. She'd be bankrupt in a year. 2 at the most. Selling the best machinery, tearing down a good barn, turning cropland to grass. It was agricultural suicide. At the Farmers Union Co-op, the talk was of numbers. They calculated the bushels of wheat she was sacrificing, the value of the cattle she was selling, the sheer staggering financial loss her plan represented. It made no sense. Wheat was $2.90 a bushel, and rising. The Soviet Union was buying every kernel they could get their hands on. Everyone was expanding, buying more land, bigger tractors. And Elspeth Finch was contracting, selling, demolishing. In the church parking lot after service, the women spoke in hushed tones. They worried for her soul. Poor Elspeth. Franklin's death had broken her.
She was isolated out there, alone with her strange ideas. They organized a casserole rotation, a gesture of sympathy for a woman they now considered a lost cause. The brothers, Caleb and Josiah, were objects of communal pity. They had been robbed, not just of the land, but of their family's history. They had to watch from their own smaller, adjacent farms as Elspeth began to enact her bizarre testament. And she did. The auction was the first public spectacle. It was held on a windy day in November. The entire county seemed to turn out. They came to watch the dismemberment. The Gleaner L combine, with only 3 seasons on it, sold for $32,000 to a farmer from Hingham. The John Deere 4430, a workhorse of a tractor, went for $18,000. The plows, the drills, the baler, all sold. Elspeth stood near the auctioneer's truck, a small, still figure in a wool coat, recording each sale in a small notebook. She did not speak to anyone. She just watched and wrote. The money, nearly $70,000 before the auctioneer took his cut, was deposited at the First National Bank of Fort Benton. It was a fortune, enough to pay off the farm's debt and live comfortably. But she did not pay off the debt.
Instead, she bought the bulldozer, a Caterpillar D6C, slightly used, from a dealer in Great Falls. It arrived on a flatbed truck a week later. The sight of it, yellow and powerful, sitting in her farmyard where the combine used to be, was a fresh source of consternation. She hired a man from Big Sandy, a fellow known for his skill with earth-moving equipment, and he started to work. Following the instructions Elspeth gave him each morning, instructions she read from another of her notebooks. He did not plow furrows for wheat. He pushed up earth into long, low berms. He scraped out shallow depressions that filled with water from the autumn rains. He began building the check dams on the Teton River, slowing the current, backing up the water into pools. The neighbors watched through binoculars. They saw their richest topsoil, the pride of the county, being sculpted into marshes. In the spring of 1977, she bought the sheep, 200 pregnant Rambouillet ewes, just as the will had specified. They arrived in a convoy of stock trucks, their bleating a foreign sound in the cattle country. She hired a Basque shepherd, an old man named Ignacio, who lived in a small trailer he parked near the house. That summer, the red barn came down. It took 2 weeks. A crew salvaged the massive timbers. Where the barn had stood, a gaping hole remained in the landscape, a missing tooth in the county's smile. In its place, smaller, lower sheds began to rise, built from the old wood. Practical, ugly, efficient. She sold the 800 acres of prime bottomland to the Hutterite colony. The sale caused another uproar. The Hutterites were good farmers, but they were outsiders. They kept to themselves, and they paid in cash. Elspeth took the money and bought U.S. Treasury bonds. Safe, boring, low yield. She was pulling capital out of the land, out of agriculture, and locking it away in paper. The years passed.
One season bled into the next. 1977, 1978, 1979. Elspeth's farm became a landmark of eccentricity. The northern pastures, once a sea of golden wheat, were now a rugged, shaggy expanse of native grasses. The sheep grazed, guided by Ignacio and his dogs. The bulldozer sat silent most of the year, its work of reshaping the land complete. The wetlands attracted ducks and geese, their calls replacing the roar of tractors. The farm was quiet. It was solvent. Elspeth paid her bills. She renewed her operating loan each year, a modest sum compared to her neighbors. She sold her lambs in the fall and her wool clip in the spring. It was a small income, a fraction of what the land could produce in wheat, but it was steady. The community stopped talking about her so much. She became a fact of the landscape, like a strange rock formation. The woman with the sheep farm. The widow who went strange.
Caleb and Josiah still farmed their land next door, still rotating wheat and fallow, still watching their sister-in-law with a mixture of anger and contempt. They were waiting for the inevitable, for the day she would fail. They believed that day would come soon, because the world outside Chouteau County was changing. The change began quietly. In 1980, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. The single biggest customer for American wheat was gone overnight. The price of a bushel, which had been climbing toward $4, collapsed. It fell to $3, then $2.50. The farmers of Chouteau County grumbled, but they held on. They had seen prices fall before. They planted fence row to fence row, hoping to make up for the low price with high volume. They borrowed more money to cover their operating costs. The next blow came from Washington, D.C.
The Federal Reserve, under Chairman Paul Volcker, began to aggressively raise interest rates to combat inflation. The prime rate, the rate banks charge their best customers, started to climb. 8%, 10%, 15%. By 1981, it was 21.5%. Operating loans that had been manageable became monstrous. A farmer who borrowed $100,000 for seed, fuel, and fertilizer suddenly owed an extra $21,000 a year in interest alone. The numbers no longer worked. The math of agriculture was broken. Debt became the enemy. Debt that had been a tool for growth was now a millstone, dragging farmers under. The value of their land, the asset against which they had borrowed, began to plummet. A man could be a millionaire on paper one year and facing foreclosure the next. Then the weather turned. A drought settled over the high plains in the summer of 1982. The rain stopped. The fields of wheat, so green and promising in June, turned a sickly yellow in July. The kernels in the heads did not fill out. Yields were cut in half. Some farmers didn't even bother to harvest. The cost of fuel for the combine was more than the grain was worth. 1983 was no better. The government introduced the payment-in-kind program, paying farmers not to plant crops, trying to reduce the massive grain surplus and prop up prices. But it was a temporary fix. It did not solve the underlying problem of debt. The wave of foreclosures began in 1984. It started as a trickle, a farm here, a ranch there. An auction notice tacked to the bulletin board at the post office. A family that had been on their land for generations, quietly packing their belongings and leaving in the night. By 1985, it was a flood. The First National Bank of Fort Benton, which held the notes on half the farms in the county, was itself in trouble. The federal regulators were circling. The bankers who had once been friends and neighbors became adversaries. They had no choice. They had to call in the loans. The green and yellow equipment, the symbols of prosperity, were now lined up in rows for auction. Not for a single farmer, but for dozens. The sound of the auctioneer's chant became the soundtrack of the crisis. The community, once so sure of its wisdom, was shattered. The old certainties were gone. Hard work was not enough. Good land was not enough. The global economy and the decisions of distant men in Washington had reached into Chouteau County and broken it. Caleb and Josiah Finch were struggling. They had done everything right, according to the old rules. They had expanded in the 70s, buying a quarter section of land from a retiring neighbor. They had taken on debt to buy a bigger tractor, a new air seeder. Now, that debt was crushing them. The price of wheat was too low to cover their costs. The interest on their loans was eating them alive. They watched their neighbors go under. The Johnsons to the south, the Millers to the west,
Their farms were bought up by an investment company from California for pennies on the dollar. The land was still there, but the people were gone. And through it all, there was Elspeth's farm, a strange island in a sea of red ink. She was untouched by the chaos. The grain embargo meant nothing to her. She sold no grain. The collapse in wheat prices was irrelevant. The high interest rates were a nuisance, but not a threat. Her operating loan was small, used only for veterinary supplies and fuel for her old pickup truck. Her major capital expenses were behind her. The bulldozer was paid for. The sheep sheds were built. Her largest asset, the money from the sale of the northern parcel, was not in land. It was in U.S. Treasury bonds. And as the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, the value of those bonds, and the interest they paid, went up. While her neighbors were paying 20% interest on their debts, Elspeth was earning 14% on her savings. Her income was modest. The wool clip and the sale of lambs brought in just enough to live on, to pay Ignacio, to cover the property taxes. But her costs were vanishingly small. She bought no fertilizer. The sheep provided that. She bought no expensive hybrid seed. The native grasses reseeded themselves. She used almost no fuel. The sheep harvested the grass on their own. Section. When the drought hit, her farm suffered, but it did not break. The native prairie grasses with their deep root systems were far more resilient than wheat. They went dormant, but they did not die. Her check dams and ponds, which had seemed like a foolish waste of river water, now held a precious reserve. While her neighbors' stock ponds dried up and their cattle grew thin, Elspeth's sheep had water. Her flock was smaller, leaner, but it survived.
The people of Chateau County began to look at Elspeth Finch differently. The pity was gone. The condescension was gone. In their place was a grudging, baffled respect. She had been right. They did not understand how. Her plan, which had seemed like a blueprint for self-destruction, had turned out to be a strategy for survival. The logic of her will, once so opaque, was becoming clear. Selling the best cropland and putting it into grass had seemed like madness when wheat was king. But it had severed her dependence on a volatile global market. It had insulated her from the price collapse.